Hey there! Before we get into this video, we have to get some annoying qualifications out of the way. I am not a content creator, and I don't really know what I'm doing here. I've always enjoyed long-form criticism videos and video essays, but I've never really felt like I had a reason for creating that kind of content myself. I play a lot of Destiny 2, and after playing through the most recent raid, Root of Nightmares, while I can't talk, I had some strong thoughts. I wrote a very long essay type thing, and I figured, hey, why not make a video out of it? All this is to say, if you were baited into clicking on this video and expecting a high degree of production quality, sorry, this is the first thing I've ever edited really, so yeah, that's a thing. But with that said, if you're still around and you're motivated enough to click on the video like this in the first place, I think maybe I have some things to say about Root of Nightmares that might be fun to think about. Let's give it a shot, shall we? Root of Nightmares is a thematically rich, visual spectacle that is ultimately let down by simplified mechanics and a difficulty tuning that fails to live up to the standards set by previous raids. Much of what has been shared and criticized about this raid is coming at it from a contest perspective, and while I share many of those sentiments, purely approaching it from that angle muddies the waters and ignores many aspects of this raid that I feel deserve criticism. Okay, so thesis stated. Don't worry, we're going to go into a lot more detail here than that. Let's start off with the opening encounter. As far as opening encounters go, this one actually makes a fairly strong impression, but also previews some issues that will compound as the raid progresses. A good opening encounter sets the stage for what the rest of the raid will be, offering a brief thematic or mechanical taste of what's to come. With the exception of Last Wish, every Destiny raid dating back to Vault of Glass has opened with some sort of introductory encounter. Sometimes these encounters are used as isolated one-offs to enrich the atmosphere of a raid like Crota's End or King's Fall, but typically these encounters serve as a sort of tutorial for what the main mechanic will be going forward. Root of Nightmares falls into the latter category, with its opening encounter introducing the idea of seeds in a more limited setting. Combat-wise, this encounter is engaging and feels great to play. Enemy density is scaled proportionally to our current abilities, and meteor targets are periodically spawned to demand single target attention. Combat manages to strike that fast, spammy, rip-through-everything flow you get into in something like a battleground. Contrasting that against the opening encounters in the last two raids, this feels great. The encounter moves at a pace you control unlike Vow, and there's enough to shoot for the whole team, unlike King's Fall. We'll get into some issues with the seed mechanic as this progresses, but in this encounter, it really works. I think one of the things that have made these opening encounters feel like a drag upon replaying them is the inability to speed them up, with Crown of Sorrow and Vow of the Disciple being notorious offenders in this regard. No such issues with Root. This encounter will move entirely as fast as the seed runner is able to make it progress. Overall, a very strong opening encounter with thought and consideration put into how it will play over the course of multiple runs. It's a tad on the easier side, but encounters like this are designed as introductory pieces, so that's entirely within expectations here. This is probably one of the better opening encounters Bungie has designed, and a great response to the valid criticism of Vow's opening encounter. Okay, let's get into the Cision encounter. Cision builds on the introductory encounter in an initially satisfying way, introducing the Darkness Seed into the mix with the Light Seed, and challenging players to efficiently use movement to weave the buffs across the ravine. Fail to do so in time, and a wall pushes your entire fire team into the ravine. Before we go any further, I just want to say, that's a great wipe mechanic, and a great animation. Super fun, and big kudos to Bungie there. It's refreshing to see Bungie embrace and encourage player movement after what has been at times a tumultuous relationship with the concept. This encounter invites you to equip those eager edge swords and burst out the various bits of movement tech that you have in your arsenal, and that's something I'm all for seeing more of going forward. The jump pads make their most prominent appearance here. These are super fun to use, but their janky implementation, at least on PC, mars the experience. The way these pads launch you is super inconsistent, particularly on Warlock. Sometimes you'll not get enough height to cross the gap, and sometimes you'll be prematurely launched to the floors above early. As a result, many groups chose and continue to choose to ignore the pads. Ultimately, this is not a huge deal, but it's a shame that these sorts of frame rate related physics oddities have gone unaddressed for as long as they have, and have such a conspicuous presence here. Issues with the core mechanic itself start to arise in Cision. The intended way for this encounter to be completed seems to be that two players for both the light and dark seed take turns getting the buff, moving it forward to either side of the ravine. As a way to keep the third player engaged, adds that are otherwise immune to unbuffed players are introduced, seemingly to invite the third player to always have the buff. While this all sounds good when played straight, many groups move to a one player gets the buff and does everything model in this encounter right away, leaving 4 players to clear adds. Unlike the opening encounter, enemy density here is not up to the task of engaging even 2 dedicated ad clear players, let alone 4. The lone deterrent to this approach is the shielded enemies, but these enemies fail to provide enough of a threat to either method. Even with the one runner method, players can slip in to get buffs when the carry player does the mechanic, and nuke them quicker than the encounter spawns the shielded adds in. The kicker is that this isn't even necessary. The encounter-specific challenge for Cision even requires ignoring these adds. In this situation, you are asking 4 out of the 6 members of the fire team to lackadaisically clear a small number of red bar adds. Not every group will run the encounter this way, but the fact that it can and will be run this way is a marked step back from the everyone has to do something design that is present in Destiny's more engaging raids. Cision provides a great framework for a raid encounter, but fails to deliver. I think that making the shielded enemies as non-consequential as they were is a huge mistake. There's nothing inherently wrong with having encounters with an ad clear role. Many successful raid encounters have such roles, in fact. The issue here is that too many players are afforded the luxury of not engaging with the mechanic and that the adds present no real threat. In Last Wish, the Knights in the Vault encounter provided additional stakes and drama to the ad clear role, giving players who aren't reading a real threat to deal with. I think a lot of what's wrong with this encounter could be fixed with that sort of mechanic. Maybe the shielded adds are attempting to rush on the other side of the room and hit some sort of switch to make the walls spawn early. Perhaps the walls are slowly closing in, and killing the shielded enemies pushes the walls back. Heck, even adding an ad sacrifice to the white pillar like Garden of Salvation would probably do the trick. Cision also makes me question what the value of the previous encounter is. If you were to start the raid here, I think Cision would serve as an equally good and digestible, albeit less fun introduction to the seed mechanic. Perhaps merging Cision with the introduction encounter and having a tighter timer that is extended by dealing with the Scions and the Tormentors would work to the benefit of both. Regardless, something is needed to challenge and engage players who are not involved with the mechanic here, particularly when the mechanic is as simple for the players involved to execute as the seeds are. Unfortunately, this will be a theme going forward for the rest of this raid. I'll keep this mercifully short as the rest of this has been long and will continue to be long as we proceed, but this is a great mechanic, particularly for a jumping section. It adds the appropriate amount of tension for this sort of section. We've seen this sort of idea before with Shelter from the Storm and Deepstone Crypt, but making this more of an active mechanic with a cool animation as the threat as opposed to a passive wait for the debuff to expire, it just adds a lot to it in my opinion. I've seen some hate for this section in the jumping section after the first boss, but I think the Refuge section does a great job of introducing a mechanic, and these sections in general are super important to the secret sauce of raids. They give a sense of scale that would otherwise be missing if we simply walked from encounter to encounter. They also allow for Bungie's art design to shine. Root of Nightmares features such a distinct, original visual style despite being just another pyramid raid, which makes a powerful impression. Highest levels of praise to this team. They keep finding ways to kill it, and I'm sure they will continue to do so in the future. With that out of the way, let's get to Macrocosm. Where Cision errs from a strong start, Macrocosm brings things temporarily back on track. Macrocosm is striking on basically all levels. Visually, it is one of the very best looking raid encounters Bungie has ever done. The level of visual spectacle from the wipe animation alone shows the huge amount of love that was put into this encounter. Additionally, the revelation that Macrocosm has been foreshadowed twice, both in our first time seeing the Witness and a Two Truths and a Lie from Savathûn, is deeply satisfying. The thematic grandeur of moving planets makes a relatively simple mechanic seem so much deeper than it actually is. That's not said critically or as an indictment. This is something that all the best Destiny raid encounters have managed to do. It elevates a simple trade with your partner mechanic into feeling like something so much more. In the wake of their overuse in WoW, information exchange mechanics have worn out their welcome for most people. However, Macrocosm does this sort of mechanic in a lighter and more satisfying way that feels much less fatiguing to deal with over time. It's also extremely refreshing to see mechanical diversity in the middle of a raid. In modern raids, Bungie has become overly attached to the idea of having one mechanic and trying to build on it the entire time. This trend is summarily reversed here. This fight uses its own mechanic, and it's evident how distinct and elevated it feels as a result. In terms of combat, Macrocosm delivers fairly well. The density is thick enough to provide an adequate amount of friction for our kit, and we're encouraged to clear adds fast in order to get to the mechanics. Unlike Cision, where most players are able to clear ads and there is no failure condition for doing so poorly, most players in Macrocosm will be involved in executing the mechanics, and effectively clearing the ads speeds things up, giving more weight to that role. This is unfortunately an outlier in this raid. Macrocosm does absolutely everything right up until the moment the boss simply falls over. Not a week into this raid's life cycle, and the health bars of Root's bosses are already notorious for being a joke, but the sad part is that perception was true even on contest mode. Traditionally, bosses like the Explicator have acted as hard DPS checks for groups, a chance to assess your damage strategy before moving forward onto a higher stakes final boss encounter. This approach has not been without issues, particularly when these sort of fights end up feeling like ammo lotteries. Atrax of Deepstone Crypt and Caretaker of Vow of the Disciple are infamous exemplars of this. What's particularly sad about Explicator is that Bungie's taking great care this time to make sure that ammo lotteries are a thing of the past. There are no less than 8 Aeon finishable enemies per DPS cycle to feed your team ammo. Aeons are a messy workaround to Destiny's core problem with the have ammo drops or you lose problem in boss fights, but it's always nice to see a 100% way to overcome ammo RNG. Heavy Ammo Scout is another brilliant addition that mitigates that problem. None of this matters though. Much as we'll see with Nezarec, the Explicator's health bar is simply tuned too low to survive an even slightly optimized damage setup. This fight has soft damage gating, and without it, I'm fairly certain we would have seen the majority of top teams one-phase this boss in contest. I'm not sure why Bungie felt like this tuning needed to be a thing. Perhaps after the Linear Fusion's year-plus run of dominance, Bungie simply did not trust our ability to deal damage after their nerf. Regardless, you would figure that a boss designed around the idea that players will have a guaranteed 22% amplification buff should they choose to use it, would have more health than the Explicator does. There's really not a lot to talk about here. In terms of damage, this boss simply demands nothing from you execution-wise to down. If you can get to damage phase, the boss dies. No drama, no pressure to hit your shots, and no optimization required. I'm really not sure there's more to this boss fight besides the boss simply needing more health. Everything else is pretty close to being an all-time great Destiny boss fight, even if some of that is smoke and mirrors the theming and the visuals provide. I'm going to start this part by dropping the veil, right away, and offering my opinion without any obfuscation. I think Nezarec is a terrible boss fight on almost all levels. There's some really good ideas present here. Nezarec's dialogue and menacing presence invite you to really feel something, but the nuts and bolts of the fight let that atmosphere down immensely. There's been some beating around the bush throughout this on my part. I love Destiny. I love raiding. I have over 900 raid clears according to Charlemagne, and will likely have many more before this game is complete. I want this content to succeed, and I'm not sure I'll ever feel the same way about a game as this franchise has managed to make me feel. My natural inclination is to be charitable to Bungie whenever possible. With the qualifiers out of the way, the seed mechanic is a very weak base to build a raid off of, and it's really laid to bear here. It very much resembles the Arctrician mechanic in the Spire of the Watcher dungeon. I felt the mechanic was weak there, and this build the chain forward motif is even weaker when asked to stand up as a core raid mechanic with 6 players present. Its implementation here allows for as many as 4 players, but realistically 3, to effectively do nothing but vaguely shoot at ads and wait for DPS to start. In terms of encounter flow, the only truly important thing to happen is for all the seedbed things to have their appropriate buff brought to them. That's it. That's a goal that can be accomplished by 2 players quicker than Nezarec has the tools to stop them from doing so. Nezarec's hatred mechanic feels like it was supposed to be the big deterrent from bum rushing the seedbeds. The Scion bounce attack is a fun idea, but does not act as an adequate obstacle to prevent the seed runners from accomplishing their goal. At worst, they're slightly hindered from doing so. The fact that players can get to DPS against Nezarec solo without doing any kind of glitches or complicated tricks makes this wildly apparent. Something more needed to be done. Perhaps a lethal detainment field that players needed to be shot out of from Eaters of World might have worked here. You can imagine Nezarec having some sort of Tormentor grab attack from a distance that works off of this and would even further serve to enhance the atmosphere. The bouncy castle movement is simply not enough of a threat from the supposed final god of pain. With assistance from even one player shooting Nezarec's chest, the mechanic becomes a non-factor. Nezarec jumping down feels like it's supposed to be a grandiose moment, a god of pain coming down from his perch, and he's furious. The dialogue, and big kudos to the voice actor for this, and the music builds it up as such. The sad part is, Nezarec is far more threatening while off the battlefield than he ever is on it. We had twice as many deaths from the aerial scythe beams as we ever did from dealing 1 Nezarec while he was on the ground, and I would imagine that rings true for most groups. At least when grounded, Nezarec's palpable fury is ultimately nothing more than an empty threat. While this is all happening, we have 3 players who are effectively tasked with doing nothing. Initially, some teams traded hatred, but it became quickly apparent that this was not something that needed to be done. While the adds in this encounter were fairly threatening on contest mode, it was a solvable problem with plenty of help on hand to do so. So much could have been elevated here by simply getting more players involved. Some sort of lockout on the dark and light buffs that required players to be cycled in and out would have gone a long way to make this a more complicated and engaging fight. This would result in more of a relay race rather than it being a sprint for 2 players only. Nezarec's wipe mechanic is supposed to, and sometimes does, add some drama to all of this. The way refuges feel like they were supposed to be used is a very cool idea and adds some spice to this. A mobile defense, not a place to bunker down. Something to dip into while you were feverishly running from your life from Nezarec, all while dreading the ticking clock of the blast attack on your head, hoping you timed it all right. Make no mistake about it, Nezarec being able to be sped up and go at the pace of your runners felt good initially and will continue to feel good as time passes. That doesn't mean it's excusable for a major mechanic to be outright skipped by the majority of groups. An easy fix for this would have been for Nezarec to do the blast attack at a much more frequent cadence, perhaps after a certain amount of the seed beds are filled. As things stand right now though, this is a non-mechanic. Maybe you have to go to a refuge once in the second cycle, but as we'll get to in a second, I suspect most players won't be seeing a second cycle very soon. Nezarec's DPS phase is the biggest tragedy of all. The way players immediately and intuitively took to doing this feels unintentional and wonky. Exacerbating this, much like the Explicator, Nezarec outright falls over without an optimized damage setup. So it's a tragedy simply because it's too easy? Well, yes, but actually no. Hard bosses are not automatically good. Easy bosses are not automatically bad. The difficulty plays a role, but is only one factor. For the DPS phase, the biggest bummer here is that you can tell a lot of care went into animating Nezarec during this phase. His attack animations are without question the very best Bungie has ever done. We all love the dynamic of Rolk fighting us back during his DPS phase, and his animations were nowhere near as exciting as threatening to look at as Nezarec's. Exciting and threatening to look at only. Simply standing on an elevated platform renders these attacks merely for show. Nezarec's teleport attack feels like it was supposed to be a gap closer to grounded players, a terrifying lunge towards a straggler with lethal implications, Rolk's kick on anime. All this is trivialized by the platforms that your runners are forced to become super acquainted with. Perhaps Nezarec's meager health pool would make a lot more sense in the sort of mobile encounter his moveset invites you to imagine. Without the platforms to stand on, there would be far less leeway to spool up Thunderlord with Divinity or sit safely in a well. Against Rolk, hitting your shots is a lot more challenging, and you are a lot more susceptible to lethal damage if you stop moving. I don't know this for certain, but this all feels like a massive design oversight that robbed us of what was supposed to be a very different fight. If this was intended, why does Nezarec have all his teleport animations that are only present during this phase? If it was not intended, how was it not caught during playtesting? Ultimately, Nezarec is the perfect final boss for Root of Nightmares, a thematically impressive and mechanically hollow disappointment. Okay, well, that concludes the review. If you were only here for that, you can probably safely close this video now. But fuck it, this is long, let's do some bonus thoughts. So, contest mode. Lots of thoughts here. I'll keep this exceedingly brief in comparison to where this could go anyway. There's a lot of thoughts out there in general on this. I'll add to them, but that's not going to be the focus of this video. So depending on where you call it, I cleared Root of Nightmares in the 0.45 percentile or 0.2 percentile of attempts. There's a reason I tactfully hid this at the end of the video. You may not want to hear my thoughts on this whole thing with that out of the way. That's fine, I get it. It's not coming from a place of elitism or contempt for less skilled players though. I'm by no means a contender for World's First. I've been fortunate enough to find a very good, consistent team to play with, and some of my best gaming memories have been grinding my head against the wall in pursuit of day ones. We've been fortunate enough to get this done all but once, but contest mode is about challenging myself as opposed to, taking joy in others' downfall. I don't care that you got the emblem and it devalues it or whatever. That's not the point of this. This was the least satisfying day one I've ever done. There's been a lot of talk about this being accessible for contest in day one. And I don't understand that conversation. 363 days a year, Destiny 2 is about what's best for the median player. Day 1 in contest is the one time that the game from a PvE perspective is not supposed to be about accessibility. We put a lot of prep into the raid. That prep certainly helped, but ultimately I feel like none of it mattered. If you're looking to get into Day 1 raiding in contest mode but you were scared off by the difficulty, this was probably a win for you. But to that I say, you shouldn't be able to run a marathon without training for one. That doesn't mean marathons shouldn't exist. This isn't something people like acknowledging, but we define ourselves so much more by the things that we're able to uniquely accomplish rather than the things that everyone is able to do. Not everyone puts the work in to get a degree from a great school. I'm flubbing my words, not editing it. But when you do, it's something to be proud of. Should the bar for those sorts of things be set lower so everyone can enjoy them? There's some thoughts here that go beyond like a silly alien video game, and they might lead us astray into like some places we don't like. But I'm firmly in the camp that these sorts of high-end challenges are good for Destiny and good in general. Bungie has always seemed to understand the weight and importance of this sort of aspirational content. Much like other MMOs, there's a certain prestige to clearing these raids early that's super alluring. These experiences are immensely meaningful to me and have previously served as a powerful motivator for my improvement as a player and for me to understand more about the game as a whole. A true benchmark. I looked at spreadsheets for the better part of 3 months leading up to this, manifesting the death of the bosses in my head over and over again. I've had countless conversations with friends about, what do we do if this happens? How do we deal with it? What if it's a total damage thing? What if it's a burst damage thing? Previously, that kind of drive and frankly obsession has been validated, both by victory and in defeat. It was a challenge worth fretting over, a dragon to slay occupying the castle in the distance. Those feelings just weren't there after this time. Unlike previous Day 1 raids I've done, I'm left feeling silly and stupid for caring as much as I did. I'm not sure how much of this is intentional, but it's weird to see them go so hard in the game needs to be more difficult direction with the daily gameplay loop, but so far in the other way for contest mode raiding. I'm still immensely happy for people who got their first clears within these parameters. I know how meaningful that feels, and I wouldn't want to take anything away from those people. I do question whether such victories will retain their value and meaning if this becomes the new normal, though. Okay, and what will be the last chapter in the entirely too long video? It's dragged on too long at this point. I doubt anyone's listening, and that's fine. I just kind of want to talk about it. So to cap this off, I want to offer some speculation as to why Root of Nightmares is the way that it is. Many people are speculating that Root was originally a dungeon with a boss fight added to it. Those sorts of theories are worth exploring and speculating on, with Lightfall seemingly being the result of the original Lightfall being pushed into the final shape, and some of the mechanical decisions they've made. I get that. What I would like to talk about is a slightly more concerning theory to me. I think the base difficulty of Root of Nightmares was designed with the idea that the predominant way that it'll be run is via the in-game LFG. That has a number of consequences for the way Bungie would think to tune the difficulty, in my opinion. We've seen this sort of things with other games before. I don't have a lot of experience with other MMOs, but I do know that WoW's pickup LFR raids are tuned to be a much lower difficulty than they would be otherwise, both in terms of the damage checks and the mechanics. It feels like Root of Nightmares is following that paradigm. With even one competent player at the mechanics going in, a random group well could clear Root of Nightmares without any trouble and in a fairly expedient manner. The issue here is that this is not one of many difficulty settings available with different loot rewards. This is the only difficulty setting available until Master comes out. Given that Master raids have been dead in the water since the addition of crafting, I have a hard time envisioning that even buffed adept weapons will be enough of an incentive for players to even bother. As much as we want a challenge, this is ultimately a looter. Whatever path offers the most efficient path towards the best rewards will be the path that everyone takes. Intrinsic motivators are not enough in a game that actively trains you towards extrinsic reward loops. So yeah, that about wraps this up. One raid is definitely not enough to say the bar is going to be lowered for every Destiny raid going forward. That would be super silly to do. I'm not trying to do that. We've had easy raids before with Scourge of the Past and Eater of Worlds. It is, however, a concerning outlier for a class of content it occupies in what is becoming an increasingly schizophrenic difficulty philosophy for Destiny. Much like Bungie, I have my own jumbled thoughts on Destiny, which I'll end with this. If this is the future of Destiny raids, they may not be for me anymore. There would be a hole that I wouldn't quite know how to fill, but I don't know, I doubt there's a world where I don't play them when they're new for the novelty factor, but in terms of something I deeply love, I sure hope this isn't the wave of the future.